Where did this idea of race come from? In past semesters, I've asked my students to tell me about when they first learned about this idea of race or racism. And it doesn't have to be one defining moment. It can be a collection of moments that over time now looking back as a scholar, they're thinking about what they learned from that. And this is what my students have to say. So one student states, I can recall many scenarios from as early as this week where someone insisted I was Hispanic because of simple physical features, for example, my hair. Another student stated, I first learned about race at a really young age. My mom had just dropped me off at gymnastics, but when I looked back, I noticed she was talking to one of the other parents. I heard the lady say, oh, that's your daughter? She's so exotic looking. Is she adopted? She looks nothing like you. Where's she from? My mom responded, she's my biological daughter. She's not adopted. She's biracial. I was 5 at the time. I did know what adopted meant, but I never considered that I was different from my mom or anyone else in my family until that moment. My entire world changed, the way I looked at myself and at my mom. Another student recounted a story of a time when her father came to school to pick her up and was required to show his identification because he didn't look like her. He was her biological father, but he didn't look physically like her. And her mother, who did have the same skin complexion as her, was never asked to show her identification. And just recalling the way the student recounted this story, it wasn't handled well. It wasn't a good situation. It wasn't just like a friendly asking for identification. The school staff was very rude to her father. And a man told me once who has a biracial child. He's European American, his wife is Asian American, and they have a child together, that he was out somewhere at the mall, I think, and a European American woman came up to him. He was with his daughter and said, where did you get that Asian baby? And his response to her was, oh, they're giving them away at Costco. You should check it out. And as I tell my students, his point in that situation is to return the gaze in a way. Here she is, this quote unquote white woman who's very forward and coming up to him and asking him about his Asian baby and where did he get such a thing. And it was very objectifying. And so to return what we often in the scholarship call the white gaze and make her think about what she was saying and make her a little bit uncomfortable and learn something from that. Certainly across different societies, racial classifications vary. It's very arbitrary how we put people into different racial categories. In some countries, your classification depends not only on your skin color, but your physical proximity to other so-called races. For example, in Africa, the meaning of colored depended on this. So in South Africa, one was either white, native African, or colored, meaning you're neither white or native. However, prior to 1948 in South Africa, race had a contextual quality. They took account of your social conditions. So people with some African descent could be classified as white if they lived among other whites among most of their lives. You could be educated and move your status to colored rather than be classified as native. Now with apartheid, these lines became less fluid. In the US, in one society alone, oftentimes racial classification varies. So in the United States, at different historical time periods, you could cross a state line and legally change race. This is something that scholars have noted in the film Race, the Power of an Illusion. Now, most of us will embrace that underneath the skin, we're basically the same. So where does this idea come from? Before the 1600, around the time of 1500 in Virginia, in Colonial Virginia, which is where I begin some of this history, people were not classified as white. So if you were to try to take a census of people and figure out how many white people or black people there were, you'd have a very difficult time because that's just not how people identified. So I often go back to 1609 to 1610. This is when children in a lot of public schools in the United States learn about the harsh winters that the settlers had to survive. And so I try to start with this historical context. So we often learn that this was a very hard winter. It was the settlers didn't know how to work the land yet. They were starving. And it was so bad that they actually, Zinn notes, Howard Zinn, that they actually resorted to cannibalism in order to survive. And we do have archaeological evidence of this now. By 1619, The English in Virginia had learned to grow corn, tobacco, but there's still a scarcity of labor in the colony. The English are of the leisure class. As in notes, they were not accustomed to doing this labor, so they do learn from Native Americans how to work the land, but they're not going to do it. The first people they try to enslave are not right away Africans. So we think that they saw dark skin, saw people with dark skin as inferior, and then automatically decided that they would enslave them. Skin color was not a precursor to enslavement. Slavery, Africans were chosen to be the slaves, and then their skin color was used as a justification, and they were chosen for very specific reasons. But first, the English tried to enslave Native Americans, and they're not very successful in doing this. We have to remember that Native Americans knew the land better than the English who were here. And by knowing the land, they could easily escape slavery. If they were put into slavery, members of their societies, their families could come and bust them out. They just couldn't hold them. And as Audrey Smedley notes, Native Americans were not disconnected individuals. It's not like they were kidnapped from a completely different continent, brought to the Americas, put in a completely different situation, and they weren't made ready. They weren't put through that middle passage where they were terrorized and made ready for enslavement. That didn't happen with Native Americans. So they, historians sometimes say they didn't make good slaves. So that's one of the reasons for why. The English could have enslaved English and Irish servants. They didn't look favorably upon Irish servants anyway. So again, skin color was not a precursor to enslavement. The English they saw Irish people as inferiors as well. And they did try. So English and Irish people were brought over as servants and had to work for a period of about 4 to 7 years to work off their servitude. So there were court cases where the masters are trying to tack on longer sentences, more years to these contracts. So the servants, the English and Irish, would take them to court and they would win because their masters didn't really have a good argument for why they were tacking on these longer time periods of their servitude. So it's not they didn't try, it's that they were having a harder time enslaving English and Irish people. There was an English common law that said that you couldn't enslave fellow Christians, so this made it more difficult to enslave fellow poor English people. Oftentimes that was read as you can't enslave other English people. So there were laws protecting them that made it more difficult for the English to enslave English and Irish people. African slaves were more vulnerable because they weren't at first Christian, so that made them more easily enslaved. But they also had immunities to old world diseases, so that made them a better choice when compared to Native Americans. Furthermore, they had important skills. They had skills that poor English servants and Irish servants didn't have. They had skills that were highly valued by the English ruling class. They were brickmakers, they could build, they could cultivate tropical plants, they could grow cotton, tobacco, sugarcane. So they became more valuable. They were also more easily enslaved because of their position as non-Christians. And also, there was an increasing number of them. So in terms of supply, just as the supply of English and Irish servants was decreasing, the supply of African servants was increasing. So all of these things contributed to making Africans more vulnerable to being the slaves of choice. But again, it wasn't dark skin color, it wasn't an automatic connection between skin color and enslavement. Now, during this time, indentured servitude and slavery are happening at the same time, and slavery is developing along with it. And so during that time, when the English had not yet developed completely the system of slavery, African Americans, people of African descent who came over to the Americas, they came over, most of them, as servants. But once they worked off their time, their contracted time, they could then move up in society. It was a class-based, not a race-based society at first. So many of them did, and they became landowners themselves. So you had former African people who used to be servants then becoming land-owning people. So they had some status. And because race wasn't a thing yet, it wasn't created yet, they weren't seen as markedly different from English people. It was class that mattered. So they had land and they had servants. Africans would have English servants and they would have African indentured servants. And so Smedley talks about how they had certain rights before race was constructed as an ideology meant to justify slavery. So they could take their neighbors to court. There would be disputes over land. For example, where my land ends and yours begins. And Africans could be very successful in winning their court cases against their English neighbors. Again, this signifies that race didn't have the same meaning that it has today. There are cases where African people would lend money to their English neighbors. Again, it was more about class. So because they had land and servants, Africans were not viewed as inferior yet. The Irish were. So it's interesting. Audrey Smedley talks about this shift between, first, Irish people were the ones who were seen by the English as uncivilized. And because of their skills, Africans were seen as civilized. After Africans are chosen as the slaves or the more easily enslaved people, then the ideology shifts. Then it is that the Irish are civilized and the Africans are uncivilized because that's the kind of ideology that is going to support the system that is being developed. Still between 1620 and 1660, the idea of race as this hierarchy, scientific hierarchy, does not yet exist. So why do we create race? It is largely to deal with the rebellions that are occurring between European servants and African slaves. Slavery and indentured servitude are occurring at the same time, but there's really no difference in treatment because race still had not yet been invented completely. So historical records from Virginia, which Smedley notes is the hub of the universe of the Americas at the time, these indicate that people of African and European descent fraternized together, they worked together, they got drunk together, married each other, lived together. And you had a growing number of English, some Irish, and African bonded servants who live under the same conditions. They don't see each other as different because this notion of race doesn't exist. As indentured servants, English and Africans were freed after they've served their time, and they began demanding land and more rights as part of this freedom. Smedley talks about a growing number of unhappy, unruly former servants who were lacking opportunities and they were frustrated. They were on the make. So these rebellions, they're very common and they're very feared by the ruling elite. So they would do little things together. And this is important to point out because it wasn't, before race was created, it wasn't natural to segregate by race. In fact, people who had similar class interests, the poor English, some poor Irish and Africans, collaborated together. They got, intermarriage was common. Collaboration was common. So they would do things like destroying master's property together, stealing hogs, little rebellions like that. But it all led up to that big rebellion in 1676, Bacon's Rebellion, which ended literally in this interracial group or interethnic group burning Jamestown down. So, of course, the elite, the ruling elite, are very scared and measures have to be taken. So what do they do? How do they create race? Largely through slave codes and laws. So in 1691, we see Virginian law calling for the banishment of any, quote, white man or woman being free who shall intermarry with a Negro, mulatto, or Indian man or woman. This is the first time the word white is used instead of Christians to talk about the English. Furthermore, any white person found in company with any slaves was to be fined along with free African Americans or Indians so offending with a fine of 15 shillings or to receive on his, her, or their bare backs for every such offense 20 lashes well laid on. And it wasn't just those engaged in marriage, those who were the ones engaging in the marriage, but the people who were marrying these individuals, they were also punished. So everyone has to be convinced of this. It's not that you create a law, and it's the same today. We've seen examples with this, certainly with same-sex marriage, right? That it's just because there's a law doesn't mean that everybody's going to follow the law at first. So what the elite have to do is disseminate this, get the word out. And they didn't have Twitter and Instagram and Facebook or social various forms of social media as we do today. What they had was the court and the church. So they have to convince people of this. So they read the laws every Sunday at the end of church for consciousness raising purposes, to prevent pretense of ignorance. Life worked a certain way where there was no such thing as white and black. Now we have to convince people that there is such a thing and that English people and Africans are different simply based upon their skin complexion. We have to justify it. It's a strange idea at first. And so we have to convince people. We read it every Sunday, and it's posted at the courthouse door as well. So that way it's very clear that these are the new laws and you have to follow them. It wasn't just a strange idea at first to the people in colonial Virginia. These folks, people who are making laws at this time, they still have to get these laws validated by England. They're still subjects of the king. So in 1723, for example, you have the Virginia Assembly writing a law. They're clearly concerned here about those interracial rebellions. They vote on this measure entitled An Act Directing the Trial of Slaves Committing Capital Crimes and for the more effectual punishing conspiracies and insurrections of them, for the better government of Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians, bond or free. What this act involved was also taking away land rights and political rights from Africans, even if they had land. This wasn't immediately accepted in England. They have to get this approved. And one of the people tasked with looking at these acts and laws was Attorney General Richard West. So he writes back after seeing this act, and he's confused. He doesn't understand why you would ever now start taking land away from people who are just like you. If they're landowners and that's what matters, what does skin complexion have to do with it? And so this is what he states. I cannot see why one free man should be used worse than another merely upon account of his complexion. To vote at elections of offices or officers either for a county or parish is incident to every free man who is possessed of a certain proportion of property. And therefore, when several Negroes have merited their freedom and obtained it by their industry have acquired that proportion of property so that the above mentioned incidental rights of liberty are actually vested in them, for my own part, I am persuaded that it cannot be just by a general law without any allegation of crime or other demerit whatsoever to strip all free persons of a black complexion, some of whom may perhaps be of considerable substance, from those rights which are so justly valuable to every free man. So he's saying, I don't understand how you can base this just on skin color. If people are the same in terms of their class status, in terms of having worked up and they have landowning status, the same status as you, skin color makes no sense. I can sort of understand if you're talking about enslaving poor people, but as my daughter would say, basing this just on skin color, that's a little bit extra. That's how she would put it. So this is what Richard West is saying. So they have to be convinced of this. Again, this is indicating that the idea of race as we understand it today was not a natural thing, and it had to be created intentionally with purpose. So this is the response to that objection. This is from William Gooch, who would later become governor of Virginia. So he states, there had been a conspiracy discovered amongst the Negroes to cut off the English, wherein the free Negroes and mulattoes were much suspected to have been concerned, and though there could be no legal proof so as to convict them, yet such was the insolence of the free Negroes at that time, that the next assembly thought it necessary not only to make the meetings of slaves very penal, but to fix a perpetual brand upon free Negroes and mulattoes by excluding them from that great privilege of a free man, to make the free Negroes sensible that a distinction ought to be made between their offspring and the descendants of an Englishman. Basically, Gooch had been hearing more rumors about rebellions between bonded servants and African slaves. He's concerned that those people of African descent who were bonded servants who then became free would then help other people, would help other slaves and servants escape, and there would be uprisings and revolutions. And he wanted to put African Americans who had freedom, who had property in some cases, in their place. He wanted to brand them forever so that they would know their place and stay in their place. Now, I'm not aware of any research on this, but I would venture to guess that this is where we see the beginnings of internalized racism in law, or wanting to institutionalize in law internalized racism, a sort of self-hatred, or taking pride away from African Americans. So England had to be convinced of this, and they were, that this idea that this branding of the Negro was important in order to create the kind of society that the ruling elite wanted to create. It was a threat to profit. Now, in addition to the punishments that we already went over in the how race was created, there had to be rewards too. Anytime you teach someone, any parent knows, any educator knows, when you teach someone something, you need to have carrot and stick. People learn not just from punishments. Punishments alone, sometimes that's just going to make people angrier. There also has to be rewards. So here comes the carrot in 1705. Basically, there's a law stating that whites are just superior to blacks. This is where we see the work of W.E.B. Du Bois being so important in characterizing what's happening here. And he calls this a public and psychological wage of whiteness. That white people are getting a psychological, emotional wage in knowing that they are better than quote-unquote blacks. But the wage wasn't just psychological, it was also tangible. So whereas before indentured servants were serving these 4 to 7 years and were angry because they had nothing to show for it, now you get these freedom dues. After indentured servitude, men were getting 10 bushels of corn, 30 shillings and a gun. Women were getting 15 bushels of corn and 40 shillings, and newly freed servants would get 40 acres of land. They were getting more days off. They could testify in court. They had nicer churches and social clubs, and they were given public deference. This is something that Du Bois writes about. So, the poorest European American would have to be referred to as Sir or Mr. or Mrs. But somebody who was of W.B. Du Bois status, with a PhD, he did not have to be referred to as doctor by the poorest European American. That the poorest European American could call W.B. Du Bois boy. Right? They didn't get public deference, and this showed up also in publishing the newspapers and things that were written. Public deference wasn't given the same to African Americans as European Americans. African Americans, for example, they were expected to step to the side if a European American was passing, to lower their head, right, not make eye contact. So this was a public wage as well. And it was public in terms of on slave plantations. So if you were a working class European American, you couldn't own slaves, or most didn't own slaves, but you could be made into the overseer. So you could be the boss, the supervisor on the plantation. You could order the whippings, right? You oversaw the plantation. So again, this is giving a kind of emotional, psychological, and a public wage, something tangible that you could see. So over time, and this takes about 100 years to create this idea of race. It wasn't an immediate thing. It did take some time for people to accept and internalize and learn. Over time, the interests of slaves and servants begin to diverge. And so then not until the 1800s do we see the emergence of science and race, really pseudoscience and race. So it wasn't that we called on science to see if there were differences between quote-unquote white people and quote-unquote black people, and science confirmed it. It was that there was a political purpose, a political will to create white and black, and a very intentional reasons behind this. And then we called on science to justify what had already been accepted socially, legally, and politically. So this is why this is known as a pseudoscience. So in the 1820s and 1830s, we have Samuel Morton, a Philadelphia physician, who starts collecting hundreds of skulls. He measures their internal capacity using mustard seeds. And he determines that Native Americans, African Americans, or people of African descent are not as intelligent as people of European descent. And Smedley notes that we know that this was a flawed science. He did things like he would take the smallest skulls from the smallest societies of Native Americans and sample largely from there, or he would sample largely from female skulls with people of color, and the skulls of men for European Americans, so that he could skew the sample to show to prove what he thought was true. And then we have Josiah Nott, whose work was informed by Samuel Morton. He writes in 1854, Types of Mankind. And he argues that human beings have separate origins, that European Americans, or quote unquote whites now, were more civilized, and Africans were less civilized and closer to the ape. So again, this is remarkable, because before race was important, before there was this realization that the idea was race was important to upholding slavery, it was that Irish were uncivilized and Africans were civilized. So now we see the reverse of that. Now, the early construction of whiteness and blackness in the late 1600s had largely to do with English and Africans. So what happens to people who don't fit this dichotomy when they come to the U.S. in large numbers? This is where we see the emergence of minstrelsy, a performance of race. So in the early 20th century, European Americans, such as the Irish, who weren't seen as white yet, right? They occupied what David Roediger called an in-between status. So they weren't white, they weren't black. Remember, again, English didn't see all whites as equals at first. And so what are we to do with these people who don't fit on either side? One of the ways that these European American immigrants participated in gaining the wages of whiteness and putting themselves on the right white side was through the performance of these minstrel shows. Right? They would put on blackface to prove that they were really white. So Roediger states that the significance of minstrelsy for European ethnics was to be able to take on blackness convincingly and take off blackness convincingly. The simple physical disguise, an elaborate cultural disguise of blacking up, served to emphasize that those on stage were really white, and that whiteness really mattered. So here, if there's any concern, if there's any, these Europeans were anxious, right? They learn very quickly which side they should be on. So through the performance of minstrelsy, where they're really mocking African Americans, they communicate to society, to the English in society, to those in power in society, which side they're on, where they stand politically, and how they should be classified. So this is what minstrelsy looks like. And it really helps to solidify white identity. We begin to see a unified white solidarity among European ethnics. This is an important playbill because this is what a lot of the European Americans would do at the time. They would put their image of themselves, the respectable, quote unquote, white man, next to the black brute who has a black face to symbolically, visually show, I'm really white. Look at the contrast. I can put this on, but at the end of the day, I can take it off. And these shows were really popular. Roediger writes about how Abraham Lincoln would go to these shows. Working class European Americans could make a living off of performing in blackface. It would pay very well. There were a lot of different themes in blackface. There was the racial theme. That was the dominant story in minstrelsy, but there were also others. Minstrelsy was a male space. It was a way for working class men to blow off steam. They poked fun at women, at women's rights. They expressed their class frustration. They would poke fun at elites and at dandies, as they were called. And they would play off of these slave images. So here's the mammy, and here I've shown an example over time of how we've seen the mammy image, usually overweight, asexual, often seen taking care of European Americans as European American children, but not her own children. The mammy also, expressed in Aunt Jemima. Here, her role is reduced to being a cook. This Aunt Jemima image comes from slavery. It was an image that justified slavery, that played off of these ideas, controlling images of African Americans. There's the Jezebel, right? The oversex. So controlling images are usually dichotomous. It's asexual, but also highly oversexed. And so you can think about how that works to justify the rape of women during slavery. This is the sambo. So whereas the mammy is often masculine, the sambo is feminine. And so we see this over time, and you see the image there of the clown face with the teeth. It says, I think it says Coon Chicken Inn there. That's a theme of restaurants in the South. So these images, if you remember from the playbill, it said coon, coon, coon. These were images that, controlling images that people who were in these minstrel shows performed. Now it's interesting, here we see another shift in imagery and ideology. We go from during slavery, where people of color, African Americans, are mammies and Aunt Jemimas, and the men are sambos, that idea that they're childlike. They're not very intelligent. They need to be taken care of. The sambo is asexual. It's the male equivalent to the mammy. So they need to be taken care of as paternalistic ideology. So slavery is really good for them. But then with Reconstruction, as African Americans are gaining rights, or supposed to be gaining rights, now we see a switch. It's no longer the harmless, childlike sambo. Now it's the rapist. And we see that here with the image of Gus in Gone with the Wind. There's an image here of the Rodney King beating. Police officers that night talked about how King was such a large brute that they were so afraid of him. And here they're surrounding him in this image. But that is a shift from, as African Americans gain rights, now we shift to black men are really dangerous. They're not this harmless sambo. So this ideology is acted out in minstrel shows. So I showed you what was going on in the early 20th century with these minstrel shows. The purpose there was to show, if they're not in between black and white. Italians are actually, and other European ethnics are actually white, and this is how they show it. But we do have minstrelsy today. Every year around, I see, this is from 2007, but I continue to, on listservs that I'm on, I continue to get emails and stories about these blackface parties at colleges, usually predominantly white colleges, but they do happen at racially diverse campuses as well. This one was celebrating Martin Luther King Jr. at Texas A&M. You see the image of Aunt Jemima. Here's another one. This was Yukon Bullets and Bubbly. So I've juxtaposed them against images of minstrelsy in the past. And so they're not wearing the black face, but that certainly still does happen. And those are the ones that every year, usually around spring break, I see the stories on of blackface still occurring at colleges. See a shirt, it says Gulf Coast Looter. This one is really interesting because if you look here, you've got a similar kind of image as that playbill. That here you've got the nice white college young man next to the black brute. So this more contemporary image begs the question, what's the purpose of minstrelsy today? Again, we continue to see this on college campuses. If minstrelsy was a way for European immigrants to gain the status of whiteness in the past, what's the meaning of this to European Americans today? This is usually happening, again, at predominantly white college campuses where there's no question that these individuals are socially accepted as quote-unquote white. They don't have that similar anxiety. I have several different answers of what it could possibly be, and I'm sure other people can come up with different answers. But it still involves, today's minstrelsy still involves putting on a highly stereotypical black identity. In the past it was, European ethnics during those minstrel shows would spend a lot of time perfecting their images. They would study very highly stereotypical slave songs. There was a pressure to be very authentically black on stage. Right, and they would put so much time into preparing this. They wanted to make sure that their songs were accurate, that they were getting the stereotypical image of the sambo just right. So today we could argue that the image some European Americans consume, right, they consume a hip-hop image. But again, with certain types of hip-hop, it's a stereotypical perception of African Americans. It's a reduction of Black or African American identity to a commodified hip-hop image. So one reason this could be happening is that today's minstrelsy serves a similar role. It's taking on an identity, but at the end of the day, you can still take off that identity, right? They're consuming this cool, black, hip hop image, but at the end of the day, they don't have to deal with the consequences of that. They can take it off. One of the points that Roediger does make is that blackface of the early 20th century was a way for men to let off steam. Right? It was about a lot of things. Again, it was about anger at women. It was about anger at the elite. And on stage, under that blackface disguise, these working class European Americans in the early 20th century could be rowdy, disrespectful, but only when they were wearing the black face. So he states that at the end of the day, quote, blackface could be everything because it was denied that it was anything. They don't have to deal, again, with the consequences. Oftentimes for these European Americans engaged in these blackface parties, there's often not any consequences for their behavior. And they don't have to live with that identity every day. So is it just about consuming and performing an identity and being able to be as rowdy and disrespectful as you want to be as long as you're wearing the blackface? It sort of gives you a space, permission to do that. Or is it about identity in another way? Is it searching for an identity? One thing I often point out, and other scholars have pointed this out as well, is that whiteness came at a cost. I've characterized it, and others have characterized it as well, as selling one's soul to whiteness. To agree with white meant giving up your rich cultural heritage. So is it mourning the loss of an ethnic identity? That, when you have European Americans who are trying to gain back that identity by identifying as Italian American or Irish American, but they don't have a strong connection to that culture. They can't speak the language. They can get to it through superficially, sometimes through just food, but they're kind of missing a strong ethnic identity. And so is there a loss of that? Or third, it could be about backlash. Is it about backlash against some of the gains made by people of color? And I think we've seen that. We saw that with Obama when Obama was running for president in 2008. There were T-shirts that said Obama 2008, and it was a picture of a monkey eating a banana. There were also people who dressed up in blackface as well, pretending to be Obama. So just as European ethnic groups were putting blacks in their place and emphasizing their own whiteness in the past, is today's blackface doing the same, asserting that whites are really on top and putting blackness and African Americans and other people of color in their place. Because, blackface is not just, putting on blackface. Today there are tacos and tequila parties and other kinds of parties that stigmatize Mexicans and Mexican Americans as well. So it's an interesting question. There's no one answer. There's several possibilities. This is a quote that I often share with students from Daniel O'Connell to show that not everybody accepted what was going on with whiteness in the U.S. Daniel O'Connell started a petition and basically said that I will never set foot on the North American continent given what is happening there. That if people there, true Irish people, would join in with their African brothers and sisters and fight against oppression. And this is something that he stated: over the broad Atlantic I pour forth my voice, saying, come out of such a land, you Irishmen, or if you remain and dare countenance the system of slavery that is supported there, we will recognize you as Irishmen no longer. There's another step here in dealing with other people who didn't quite fit on that black-white dichotomy. In the early 20th century, and actually starting in 1790, Congress restricted citizenship to only white people, and this remained in effect until 1952. So courts had to decide who was white, and people of color, people we see as people of color today, were trying to work for that whiteness. They had to go to court and prove it. So I want to cover two important Supreme Court cases, Azawa and Thind. This is documented in Ian Haney Lopez's book called White by Law. So first we had the case of Azawa. Azawa was born in Japan in 1875. He came to the United States in 1894, and he went to the University of California. He became a businessman in Hawaii. He applies for citizenship in 1914, but is denied. He appeals to the U.S. District Court in Hawaii in 1916, and he's denied there as well. So his court case reaches the Supreme Court in 1922. Ozawa appealed to both scientific and common sense beliefs. He states, this is also in the film Race, the Power of an Illusion, my honesty and industriousness are well known among my Japanese and American friends. In name, Benedict Arnold was an American, but at heart he was a traitor. In name, I'm not an American, but at heart, I'm a true American. But he also says something about skin color. He says, in the typical Japanese city of Kyoto, those not exposed to the heat of summer are particularly white-skinned. They are whiter than the average Italian, Spaniard, or Portuguese. So basically, as long as we Japanese stay out of the sun, we should be classified as white. Right? So he's saying that there are Japanese people who are whiter than people who are of European descent and classified as white. So shouldn't we also be classified as white? But the court rules this: the words white person are synonymous with the words a person of the Caucasian race. So the appellant in this case now under consideration is clearly of a race which is not Caucasian. So you have to prove you're white, you have to prove that you're Caucasian. This ruling didn't just affect Ozawa. It meant that all Japanese living in America could not be citizens. And this was followed by the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 that barred Japanese immigration. Now it gets more interesting when Bhagat Singh Thind comes to court. He comes just 3 months later. Thind was born in a Sikh community in the Punjab region of India on October 3rd, 1892. He leaves India in 1912, hoping to become a spiritual leader. Like Ozawa, he attends UC Berkeley. He arrives in the U.S. on the 4th of July in 1913. He's recruited into the Army, so he fights for the U.S. He's recruited in July 1918. He fights in World War I. He achieves the rank of acting sergeant. Right? He goes to court. 3 months later, he brings his court, reaches the Supreme Court, and he has evidence that anthropologists do in fact classify Asian Indians as Caucasian. So Thind has a strong case. Given the precedent just set by the Supreme Court's ruling in Ozawa, white and Caucasian are synonymous. However, Justice Sutherland, who was the same justice who presented the ruling in Ozawa, states, the conclusion that the phrase white persons and the word Caucasian are synonymous does not end the matter. It enabled us to dispose of the problem as it was there presented, but the decision still left the question to be dealt with and doubtful in different cases. And then they state, it is a matter of familiar observation and knowledge that the physical group characteristics of the Hindus render them readily distinguishable from the various groups of persons commonly recognized as white. So the courts gave the appearance that they were really struggling with the definitions intellectually, and they're trying to figure this out, but really what they were concluding is that we just know you're not white by looking at you. Now, as a result of the ruling in Thind, the federal government began a campaign to denaturalize Asian Indians, and at least one person commit suicide as a result. And I think it was because the situation was so anomic for him. If you read his suicide letter, he's writing about how he thought what he thought was true is not true, and his actions didn't matter as much as he thought they mattered. Working hard to be a good American citizen, at the end of the day, it can be taken away from you. For more on these cases, Ozawa and Thind, and some of what I have to say about this in terms of American citizenship, you can view my talk that I gave at the Strand in 2018, July 2018. I'll also put the link in the description below so that you can click on it. Some final points. Race and whiteness are still being created. Those accepted as white, this is an idea that changes over time. Many scholars see whiteness as a club. And as a club, certain members of certain ethnic groups can be included at certain times and kicked out, right? I've often looked at Asian Americans as this group. Asian Americans are often classified as honorary white, but are they truly accepted as white, and at what times? How did that affect them during Japanese internment? How does that affect them today? It's not a done deal. Race is not real, but that doesn't mean we're saying that racism is not real. So race is not real, but racism is. And colorblindness is not the answer. That's a whole other, a lecture for another time. Is there hope? Well, I often share with my students a quote that somebody shared with me. I was a graduate student, And I went to a conference, and after hearing all of this stuff being presented, the situation seemed so difficult to overcome. And what one of the professors at this conference said to me was that we've believed that the world was flat longer than we've believed in race. And so he was very hopeful. Now, I don't know if this statement is entirely accurate, but I understood his sentiment. I understood what he's getting at. This is a depressing story, but it is also an empowering one. What it says is that human beings with similar interests naturally united. We allowed ourselves to be segregated, but even in the worst times, not everyone made those decisions. People like O'Connell and others did protest. We do have agency. And I try to remember the 80-20 rule. It's usually 20% of the population that moves the 80% forward. And this is something I think we've seen throughout history.